He lost everything when his partner betrayed him. But how do you bury a ghost when that ghost is wearing the silk suit of the man who stole your life? This is the story of a reckoning. In the next few moments, we will see how Elijah, the forgotten man, walked back into the kingdom built on his ruin to reclaim what was stolen. The smell of polished marble and cold money hit him first. Elijah was a slab of granite carved from the deep woods, wearing threadbare flannel. His boots, old, heavy, smelling faintly of pine resin, were a desecration on the flawless white floor. Thump, thump, every step was a declaration. He walked deeper into the showroom, chrome and glass. Everything looked expensive, untouchable. Everything he was not. He saw his reflection shimmer in a pristine desk, a ghost standing where only kings belonged. That polished surface cracked something inside him. It wasn't the reflection he saw. It was the sharp, blinding pain of the original betrayal. The handshake, the ink drying on the papers that promised prosperity, but only delivered ruin. His partner, Charles, smiling, clean, predatory, as the forests they had built went up in smoke, leaving Elijah nothing but dust. He took a breath, the scent of expensive leather momentarily replaced by the metallic tang of old regret. Elijah opened his eyes. The show was starting. The scent of expensive leather evaporated, replaced by the sterile smell of the hospital waiting room where Elijah had spent the night after the papers were signed. He'd lost the company, yes, but the real cost was the diagnosis. His father, crushed by the debt Charles had leveraged, had suffered a debilitating stroke. Charles hadn't just stolen the forests, he'd stolen Elijah's future security and nearly his sanity. The reckoning didn't start with a clean plan. It started with a chipped ceramic mug of cold coffee and a desperate need for $500 just to pay the specialized nurse. That was the moment Elijah understood. Charles had built his empire on quicksand, and to fight him, Elijah had to become the mud beneath the quicksand. He knew Charles dealt only in high-stakes, legitimate-looking larceny, and soon Elijah would learn that legitimate-looking was just a veneer. He realized the battle wasn't against a wealthy man, but a structural rot. He vanished from the city's notice. For 3 years, Elijah lived on nothing but grit and instant ramen. His first real job was logging, not the mechanized, union-backed kind, but clearing scorched earth in northern Idaho after a massive wildfire. Days were spent choking on soot, swinging an axe until his palms were ribbons of raw flesh. The pay was abysmal, but it was cash, untraceable, heavy in his pocket. He slept in a tent that smelled permanently of pine smoke and sweat. But the physical pain was a necessary distraction, a substitute for the screaming rage he held captive inside. He needed the weariness so he wouldn't plot murder. He needed the callous to armor his soul. Yet even in the desolation, the memory of Charles's smirk fueled him more than food. The logging money was a trickle against the dam Charles had constructed. He realized he needed speed. He moved south, working high steel in booming construction zones, often unlicensed. He learned to look away when the foreman shorted the books and learned to take the highest, most dangerous shifts because they paid triple hazard pay. One night, hauling materials illegally across state lines, the trailer hitch snapped. The cargo, heavy machinery parts, slammed into the road. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He left $200,000 worth of someone else's property scattered like roadkill, kept the meager transport fee, and drove until the sun rose. That night, the man who cared about the environment, the honest partner, died. Only the financier remained. He never looked in the rearview mirror, but the metallic taste of guilt lingered for weeks. The line between hard work and outright crime blurred into a permanent gray fog. He started running specialized errands for a crew operating out of Phoenix, transporting unregistered rare metals, moving sensitive documents, always skirting surveillance. He never carried a weapon, but he learned to speak the language of leverage and threat, a language Charles understood intimately. He saved every penny, banking the funds through offshore accounts set up by a disgraced former accountant he found in Reno, a necessary expense. He discovered Charles had a secret fondness for high-risk Peruvian silver futures, information that felt like a dropped key in the dark. He knew then that Charles had his own hidden vices, cracks Elijah intended to exploit. Elijah was no longer recognizable. The threadbare flannel was a conscious choice now, a uniform of anonymity. His hands, once strong and capable, were scarred and perpetually stiff from old breaks and chemical burns sustained during an ill-fated job cleaning industrial waste tanks. He calculated the exact amount needed, not just to wipe Charles out, but to assume control of the parent company, Ascendia Holdings, and dissect it piece by piece, proving the theft was always about control, not survival. He realized that the years of sacrifice hadn't just bought him capital, they had bought him patience, the one asset Charles always lacked. He wondered if, in gaining control, he had simply traded one prison for another. The physical labor stopped. The second phase of his war required brains, not brute force. He spent 6 months in a dilapidated Chicago apartment, studying corporate law, financial instruments, and digital forensics. He learned the intricate dance of shell corporations and tax havens. He found the weak spot in Charles's fortress, a series of undocumented loans tied to properties in Belize, handled by a single paranoid lawyer in Geneva who held the keys to the entire house of cards. Getting to that lawyer would require a move Elijah had promised himself he'd never make. This discovery solidified the unsettling truth. Charles was much bigger and dirtier than Elijah had first suspected. The path to Geneva required millions he didn't yet possess. The answer came through his Phoenix contacts, a high-level extraction job. The target: classified intellectual property from a rival firm. It was industrial espionage, pure and simple. The payment was substantial, life-changing money. But the firm he was hired to steal from? It was one Charles had targeted years ago, forcing Charles's competitor into bankruptcy. Now, Elijah was taking the last remaining salvageable assets, ensuring the rival was crushed completely. He was becoming the very thing he hated, using Charles's tactics against Charles's victims. He took the money, feeling a profound sickness, a true measure of his decay. He executed the espionage perfectly, a ghost in the machine. He moved the money, funneling it through 3 continents, watching Charles's net worth balloon from a distance. The irony burned. Charles continued to succeed, expanding his operations seemingly effortlessly, financing new showrooms and lavish personal acquisitions. Elijah realized Charles wasn't just lucky, he was protected. Protected by whom? The thought chilled him more than any sub-zero job site ever could. Charles had powerful silent partners who preferred their names kept out of the polished marble and chrome. He suddenly understood the true scale of the hydra he was trying to decapitate. Elijah needed a clean public face for the final acquisition, a distraction. He spent a year cultivating a relationship with a respected but highly leveraged venture capitalist named Eleanor Vance. He fed her proprietary information he'd stolen, allowing her to make millions, slowly earning her loyalty. He knew she was honest, perhaps naive, but she was the perfect tool. She had the credibility he lacked. He offered her a controlling stake in a shell company he controlled, insisting she manage the public-facing side of the takeover. He didn't tell her the ultimate goal was ruin. He rationalized that Eleanor's potential loss was a necessary casualty in a much larger war. The cumulative physical damage was immense. His eyes, perpetually bloodshot from lack of sleep and chemical exposure, sometimes twitched uncontrollably. He had chronic pain in his left knee from that drop off the scaffolding in Miami, but every ache, every scar was a ledger entry, a silent calculation of the years taken from him. He had paid for his future with his health, exchanging lifespan for leverage. He knew Charles wouldn't recognize this ruined, sharpened man. The Elijah who existed now was merely the instrument of the past Elijah's rage. He was ready to exchange all of it for 10 minutes of Charles's panic. His father died 18 months into Elijah's shadow war, alone in the care facility, whispering a name Elijah refused to forget: Charles. The old man hadn't forgiven the betrayal. He had simply run out of time. That moment solidified the mission. It wasn't about the money anymore, or even the company. It was about honoring the ghost who had been broken by Charles's greed. Elijah had paid for the best palliative care available, but Charles's debt could only be repaid in public humiliation and total erasure. The promise he whispered over his father's body was the foundation of his new empire. The pine resin scent from his boots grounded him back in the polished showroom. The reckoning had taken 7 agonizing years, 7 years spent building a financial war machine capable of crushing a giant. He had the capital, the intelligence, and the perfect, unwitting pawn in Eleanor. But as he looked past the chrome, toward the executive elevators, a final, chilling thought hit him. He had spent so long becoming the predator, he wasn't sure he remembered how to be the man who deserved the life he was about to steal back. He touched the faint scar above his eyebrow, feeling the cold marble under his worn boots. The show was indeed starting, and Elijah was ready to pay the admission price with what little was left of his soul. Elijah was ushered not into the main lobby, but a small soundproof annex reserved for pre-qualified contacts. The room itself screamed calculated indifference, minimalist white leather, and a single piece of abstract sculpture that probably cost more than his childhood home. He sat down, the worn leather of the armchair protesting faintly under his weight. He had requested this meeting under the assumed name of Elias Thorne, a ghost corporation built exclusively for today's performance. His heart rate, typically arresting 55, was creeping up, not from nerves, but from a strange, cold excitement. He was here to collect, and the collection agency was about to send a very pointed message. 15 minutes past the scheduled time, Julian Vance finally strolled in. Julian wasn't Charles, but he was Charles's mirror, sleek, perfectly tailored, smelling of bespoke cologne and effortless contempt. He didn't apologize for the delay. He merely glanced at Elijah, who hadn't stood up, and then dismissed the assistant with a wave. Julian walked past the low glass table, sinking into the opposing chair, crossing one expensive Italian leather shoe over the other. He didn't offer a hand, nor did he make eye contact initially. His gaze traveled downward, starting at the cuff of Elijah's inexpensive trousers. "Mr. Thorne," Julian began, drawing out the name as if tasting something vaguely unpleasant. "I apologize if I kept you waiting, but Charles's portfolio requires a certain filtering. We deal only in proven liquidity, you understand." Julian picked up the single page Elijah had submitted. A summary of potential future assets, deliberately vague, yet overwhelmingly large. "Your figures are compelling, certainly. Abstractly compelling. But there are certain presentation requirements when dealing with the highest tiers of acquisition." He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air, then finally looked at Elijah's face, searching for the expected flinch. Elijah offered no flinch. He simply returned the stare, his eyes the color of cold river stones. He allowed the silence to stretch, thick and uncomfortable, filling the room with the unspoken truth that Julian was the one trying too hard. Julian, frustrated by the lack of reaction, let his eyes drop again, settling precisely on the boots. The contrast was jarring, the polished marble floor reflecting the pristine soles of Julian's shoes, juxtaposed against the dull, scuffed leather of Elijah's work boots, the edges still stained faintly with pine resin from years ago. They weren't just old, they were used. "Those are interesting choice of footwear," Julian finally commented, attempting to frame the insult as casual observation. His voice was smooth, engineered to dismiss. "We usually prefer our potential partners to demonstrate that they've graduated beyond fieldwork, unless, of course, this entire operation of yours is still being run out of a workshop somewhere." Julian chuckled lightly, a sound devoid of humor. Elijah didn't move. He didn't explain that these boots were a deliberate anchor, a reminder of the ground he had been forced to stand on while Charles ascended. He knew Julian expected him to defend his choices, to apologize for his humility. "The foundation of any structure must be solid, Mr. Vance," Elijah finally said, his voice low and unexpected, a low register that demanded attention. "I tend to focus on the structure, not the ornamentation." The response was calculated to destabilize. Julian frowned, realizing this wasn't the typical nervous financier trying to break into the inner circle. This man was supremely confident, yet dressed like a day laborer who had won the lottery. "Look, we appreciate the tenacity, but ambition only gets you so far. When you're talking about integrating with Charles's infrastructure, you need proven, visible commitment. You need history." "History," Elijah echoed softly, leaning forward just enough to shift the light across his face, revealing the faint, thin scar above his eyebrow. "History is subjective, Mr. Vance, and it is about to be rewritten." Julian laughed again, louder this time, clearly forcing the joviality. "Bold talk. We hear it every week. People come in here promising revolution, and they leave with nothing but a brochure and a polite refusal. Tell me something specific. What exactly is the asset you are bringing to the table that Charles himself cannot simply replicate or crush?" Julian gestured toward the door, subtly indicating how easily Elijah could be dismissed. Elijah stared straight past Julian's shoulder, focusing on the skyline outside the panoramic window. "I am bringing the one asset that Charles fundamentally lacks: comprehensive understanding of the weakest link in his entire operation." This wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet certainty of a pathologist identifying a terminal illness. Julian's smile finally faltered. He straightened slightly. "Everyone thinks they know the weakness. Charles has layers of defense, Mr. Thorne. Security, legal, political leverage. He is untouchable. He spoke the word untouchable with the zeal of a true believer. Is he? Elijah challenged, the single word hanging in the air like smoke. He hadn't raised his voice, but the entire atmosphere in the annex tightened. Julian started fidgeting with the heavy gold watch on his wrist. Julian didn't know who this man was, but the sheer lack of desperation radiating from him was terrifying. Julian thought he was dealing with a low-level competitor. He was staring down the barrel of a financial railgun. Let's cut the theatrics, Mr. Thorne. You want to talk merger or acquisition? Give me the percentage you demand and the specific division you want control of. We don't have all day for philosophical riddles. Elijah leaned back again, relaxing completely into the expensive chair, a stark contrast to Julian's tightening posture. I want control of the debt, all of it. The request was simple, yet utterly nonsensical in the context of a typical corporate meeting. Julian blinked. The debt? Our debt is massive, highly diversified, and leveraged across 3 continents. Are you suggesting a hostile takeover of the entire portfolio? Julian felt a cold spike of panic. This Elias Thorne wasn't seeking a piece of the pie. He intended to eat the entire oven. Elijah merely smiled, a slow, predatory curving of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. Hostile. No. Elijah corrected smoothly. Thorough. I am here to discuss the prompt, orderly, and inevitable liquidation of Charles's entire edifice, starting with the liabilities that have been deliberately overlooked. He paused, letting the word deliberately sink in. Your initial assessment, Mr. Vance, judging me by my presentation, was correct. I am not like the others. I didn't come here to ask for a seat at the table. I came here to remove the chairs. Julian felt a sudden, profound realization. The polished, superficial world he inhabited was about to be washed away, and the man in the worn boots was the flood. Julian's mind raced, searching for Charles's emergency contact number. You can't touch us. We are protected. Charles has the strongest legal team in the state, and every contingency is covered. He was reciting company doctrine, but his conviction was cracking. You underestimate the power structures here. The system protects the winners. Elijah lifted one of his heavy boots slightly, pointing it towards the pristine floor. The system, Mr. Vance, protects those who understand its flaws. I spent 7 years studying those flaws. And right now, the only thing protecting Charles is the fact that I haven't officially pressed send. Elijah stood up, his height sudden and imposing, leaving Julian seated and diminished. Keep the portfolio summary. Tell Charles that Thorne requested payment in full, and tell him that the man who delivered the message wore his father's old boots. I expect his response before the market opens tomorrow. He turned and walked toward the exit, his worn soles scuffing lightly on the marble. Julian watched him go, paralyzed, realizing too late that the pine scent wasn't just dirt. It was the smell of the coffin being built. The meeting was over, and the reckoning had just begun. Elijah drove away from the sterile glass tower and the scent of Julian Vance's expensive panic. He didn't head straight to his lawyer. He drove north, away from the concrete arteries of the financial district. The worn, oiled leather of his father's boots pressed against the accelerator, steering him toward a different kind of commerce, miles away from the manicured lawns of corporate finance. His destination was the massive corrugated steel warehouse on the edge of the industrial park, the regional distributor for specialized logging equipment. This felt real. The marble office felt like a stage set. It was a place where value was measured in tensile strength and horsepower, not derivatives and equity. Elijah was making a statement, and that statement needed 6,000 horsepower of confirmation. He was operating on absolute certainty. The check hadn't cleared, but the trap was sprung. If Charles Thorne paid, the money was Elijah's. If Thorne refused, the public exposure would destroy him faster than any lawsuit. Thorne was already financially leveraged, and Elijah knew exactly which assets were the easiest to liquidate and exactly how long it would take to turn them into heavy iron. He met Leo, a grizzled salesman whose face looked like poorly maintained leather, stained with decades of diesel fumes and cold weather. Leo didn't recognize Elijah Thorne, the man who had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar corporation over a phone call. To Leo, Elijah was just another potential contractor, maybe a slightly ambitious one. Leo offered him lukewarm coffee in a polystyrene cup, the standard fuel of honest, non-leveraged capitalism. "So you looking for a forwarder, or are we talking about the real muscle?" Leo asked, gesturing vaguely toward a towering yellow machine parked near the loading bay, a behemoth capable of clearing an acre in an hour. Leo's casual disregard for Elijah's history only magnified the silent drama unfolding. Leo was completely unaware that the man across from him was about to execute a corporate raid using machinery as the weapon. Elijah listened patiently while Leo extolled the virtues of the Ponsse Bear, its efficient hydraulics, its advanced cab controls. He agreed to a quick walkthrough. Elijah, who hadn't physically operated logging equipment in nearly a decade, felt the familiar thrum of the engine beneath his hand, a physical connection to the life Charles Thorne had systematically poisoned and stolen from his family. The feel of the steel was a grounding force. Leo noticed the proficiency in his grip on the joystick. The muscle memory of the forest was still there. "You've done this before," Leo stated, slightly impressed, wiping his hands on a rag that was permanently black. "You definitely don't look like an office guy. You know how to size up a tree." The small detail showed Elijah hadn't just been an owner. He had been a worker, making the betrayal sting even deeper. That knowledge, the technical knowledge of the machines, was the true advantage Thorne never accounted for. The silence stretched as Elijah stepped down from the monstrous machine. The smell of oil and fresh rubber was intoxicating, a stark, honest smell compared to Julian Vance's expensive cologne. Leo, sensing the moment was right, leaned in conspiratorially, switching to the practical business pitch. "Look, for a startup operation, or even expanding a medium outfit, I usually steer folks toward the smaller Fox model. It's reliable, cuts down on operating costs, and frankly, it's easier to finance a single machine right now. Let's get you set up with one. Give it 6 months, and then we talk about the big league." He tapped his pen on a glossy brochure featuring the single, manageable harvester. Leo's advice was sound, the path of slow, sustainable growth, which only highlighted the destructive velocity of Elijah's actual plan. The transaction had to be an immediate, paralyzing blow, not a phased investment. Elijah took the brochure, his eyes fixed not on the glossy picture, but on the small, almost invisible serial number printed at the bottom. He remembered his father telling him how they always tracked every unit bought, sold, or retired in the state, giving Elijah a ghost accounting of Thorne's entire operation. He crumpled the paper slowly, the sound surprisingly loud in the echoing metal building. The easy smile vanished. He lifted his gaze, meeting Leo's now slightly skeptical eyes. "A single machine, Leo?" he asked, his voice low and steady, a sound that carried the weight of 7 years of meticulous planning and patient hunger. Leo flinched, recognizing a sudden shift in the temperature of the room. Realizing this was no longer a casual inquiry about cash flow, this was something else entirely. Elijah ignored the suggestion of the single, smaller machine entirely. He didn't even acknowledge the word finance or the concept of 6 months. He reached into his coat and placed his father's worn, leather-bound wallet, the same one Julian Vance had implicitly mocked, on the counter. He took a deep breath, the air thick with metallic dust and destiny. "I need you to pull the standard purchase agreement, Leo. The full commercial liability contract. No financing, no leasing, outright cash payment." He paused, letting the scope of the instructions sink into the atmosphere around them. The silence was absolute. "I'll buy 6 Ponsse Harvesters." The demand hung in the air, a physical weight. The choice of his father's wallet made it clear. This wasn't Thorne paying a debt. It was Elijah collecting a ruinous toll. Leo stared, slack-jawed, the polystyrene cup finally slipping entirely from his fingers and splashing coffee onto the concrete floor. 6, not 2, which would be an ambitious expansion. 6. That number represented a significant fraction of the distributor's entire annual allocation of top-tier harvesting equipment. 6, Leo finally choked out, disbelief warring violently with sheer, astronomical avarice. "Sir, that's nearly $20 million in capital equipment. We don't keep that stock on site. It would require immediate transfer of funds and a contractual penalty if the deal falls through." Leo was sweating now, calculating the monumental commission in his head, an amount that would change his life forever. The sheer scale was meant to be punishing. This wasn't about filling a need, it was about creating a vacuum in Thorne's assets. "The funds are already in escrow, Mr. Thorne," a crisp, almost digital voice interrupted, echoing from Elijah's pocket. It was his lawyer, the unseen executor of the final stage. Elijah didn't even glance at the phone. "The transfer will be initiated the moment Charles Thorne confirms receipt of my initial message. We are simply preempting his response, ensuring the money is secured the instant he releases it." Elijah knew Thorne was trapped. Refusing the transfer meant global exposure of the fraudulent deal, while accepting meant watching a huge chunk of his liquid assets vanish into the gaping maw of 6 pieces of expensive, non-liquid heavy machinery. The money was burning a hole in Thorne's balance sheet, even before the wires officially crossed. Leo scrambled, suddenly energized by the smell of $20 million. Grabbing a stack of intimidating, multi-ply forms from a locked filing cabinet, usually reserved for corporate clients only. The air in the metal building grew thick with unspoken meaning. This purchase wasn't about harvesting timber efficiently. That was incidental. It was a financial declaration of war, a public, irrevocable statement that the debt had been collected, not just repaid, but collected with crippling interest in the most tangible way possible. Each zero on the invoice was a tick mark against Thorne's years of impunity. The machines were just the receipt for Thorne's shattered empire. The paperwork was signed in stunned, echoing silence, the sheer magnitude of the transaction serving as the definitive, public, and financial manifestation of karmic justice. Elijah's hand, steady and firm, scrawled his name across the bottom line. It was the first truly honest signature he'd made in years. A clean purchase funded by corrupt money, Leo, still visibly shaking, stammered, "A thank you," utterly humbled by the sudden windfall. "The delivery schedule, sir?" he asked tentatively, his voice raspy. Elijah paused, slipping the carbon copy of the receipt, the cold, hard evidence of Thorne's sudden, massive loss, into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "The delivery schedule?" Elijah repeated, pulling on the gloves he hadn't needed for the signature. He looked at the 6 blank spaces on the contract designated for location. "You can't deliver them yet, Leo. Not until the entire consignment is paid in full, and I have confirmation of the full title transfer from Thorne's holding company, secured against the initial debt." He gave Leo a tight, unreadable smile. "I don't want the machines yet. I just need the receipts." He knew the moment those signed documents hit the wire, Charles Thorne would realize he hadn't just lost a battle. He had just bankrolled the resurrection of his greatest enemy, turning his stolen wealth into Elijah's strategic armor. The boots had done their job, and the paperwork was merely the ammunition for the next step. It had taken 3 agonizing months, but the paperwork, the receipt, the carbon copy tucked against his heart, had done its lethal, efficient work. Charles Thorne did not die, which would have been too merciful. He simply evaporated, his empire collapsing inward, leveraged to the hilt, and seized by the very mechanism Elijah had created out of nothing, or rather, out of Thorne's own debt. Elijah stood now in the heart of his new domain, acres of concrete sprawling beneath a sky heavy with industrial promise. He was surrounded by the proof of his resurrection. Mammoth cranes stretched their necks into the clouds. Bulldozers sat like sleeping giants, and specialized drill rigs, worth more than the GDP of a small nation, gleamed under the afternoon sun. He walked the perimeter, not in the old defeated boots that had marked his humiliation, but in custom-made heavy leather, polished obsidian black. He paused beside the largest excavator, running a gloved hand, the same hand that had signed the final transfer of title over the cold, pristine steel. He was the undisputed magnate, the gravity in this region. This was the moment of climax, the absolute culmination of revenge disguised as business. He had won. He looked down at his new boots, then at the dirt below. He hadn't just reclaimed his name. He had rebuilt the entire world around him using the ruins of the man who tried to bury him. But as the immense power of the machinery settled over him, a profound realization, chilling and sharp, pierced the victory. This wasn't redemption. Redemption implied the return to a state of grace. This was conquest. He had simply taken dirty money and molded it into clean, overwhelming power. He hadn't escaped the mud. He had paved over it with concrete and steel, ensuring he would never have to touch it again. The world had never been about being good. It was only ever about being insurmountable. He learned, finally, that the ground beneath his feet didn't matter. It was the weight above it that wrote the history. Thank you for watching this story conclusion. If you enjoyed Elijah's journey from humiliation to absolute power, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for the next chapter in the saga.